following week's parsha on a Shabbos. I read it in Hebrew and in English. And so it says there, this week's parsha and this upcoming week's parsha, it's where Jacob gets given a wife. He works for Lavan, gets deceived, works for 14 years, gets Leah, and he gets Rachel. So it says, Leah says that she was hated. That Yaakov really only loved Rachel. He liked her, but it wasn't on the same level. And Leah despaired. So Leah was actually blessed with offspring a long while before Rachel was. And because of her sorrow and her sadness, Hashem blessed her and he rewarded her. And I don't want to say felt sorry, but he was there for her. He heard her cries. And she was blessed with having, I think, about 6 children before Rachel even had. So obviously, these are people on a high level. These are like the imaot. So that's it's just a lesson that if someone is sincere about their beliefs or their ideals, then Hashem will come to the party and look after them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
thanks for that.
Yeah, so she despaired, and then Hashem saw her despair and sadness and blessed her with more children.
Yes, 100%. That makes sense. Just incidentally, we learned from Rabbi Goldschmidt. We was talking about Esav, and that Esav subdued the animals because he took over that coat that would subdue all the animals from the time of Noah. And he was saying that Daniel subdued with Hashem's help, the lions, but he didn't have that coat. So the primary difference was the coat. And he was just saying that Esav needed an external tool, whereas Daniel didn't. And he was talking about the contrast of when he said, "Pour that red stuff in my mouth," it was where Yaakov turned around to me, didn't sneak the brocha away from him by withholding food in return for the brocha, because I said there was a bit of a difficulty because he came there for the availus of Abraham. So he was entitled to get fed, but he said he wanted wine with the food. And Yaakov turned around and said, "You can't have wine because you're the firstborn. You have to serve as a Kohen, and you cannot serve inebriated." And he said he's not interested in any of the spiritual stuff. He just wants the physical. And then Yaakov had license to go into the conversation and said, "Well, if it's not important, it is to me. So I'll give you everything you want, but I want what's important to me, and you can have all the physical." They made a pact, but it was based on Esav's response first. And he conversed it with Daniel, who basically abstained from Nebuchadnezzar and all the food with Nebuchadnezzar, and abstained from wines, as well as Shadrach. There were 3 martyrs that were in the fire, and they basically abstained from the tray food between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they were just living off seeds. They didn't have any issue of bishul achim, etc. And basically, because they abstained from wines and foods, they merited to be protected because they chose that physical abstinence as opposed to the spiritual abstinence, whereas Esav needed the coat to protect him from lions because he chose spiritual abstinence instead of physical abstinence. So he was just inverting 2 contradictions between them. It was quite interesting. All right, let's get back to the Gemara. So where we ended off is we discussed that there were certain, the general opinion is that physical change does affect acquisition, but there were certain Tanoim that were holding at the position where they believed that a physical change didn't affect acquisition, as you know. And it brought each of those cases along. I mean, I'm not going to go through each of them, but I mean, you do know what those who they were, etc. Guys?
Yes.
Okay, so do you remember where we ended off? I remember where we ended off. I'm testing you guys. I'll tell you exactly where we're in, but I'm testing you guys. What was the concept of what we dealt with in the last year? I want to see if you guys were a bit aware.
Give us a hint.
Give us a clue. Yeah, give us a clue.
Yeah, give us a clue. Sorry.
Okay, so there was basically this whole issue with Rav Papa. Okay, and Rav Papa turned around and he said, listen, you turning around and saying there's certain Tanaim that you're bringing as a proof are actually turning around and saying that a physical change doesn't affect acquisition. He said to a buyer, because a buyer was the one, there was a buyer in Rubber that said there's certain Tanaim that hold that a physical change doesn't affect acquisition. And in all those cases, Rav Papa said that maybe the cases that you brought were the exception and they hold like the other Tanaim, and they believe that it does affect acquisition, but in these cases not. So what were some of those cases? Well, if you have a look, if you look at this case with Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, there were many Tanaic opinions that even Shammai held like Rav Hillel, that when the physical forms changed, that it did affect acquisition, but it was only Rav Asberg of it was only a case of if you have a look at Gurion of Asberg that turned around and said that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai disagreed, and these Tanaim have to hold as an exception to the halacha because the halacha goes with Beis Hillel. But according to the other Tanaim, Beis Shammai agreed with Rav Hillel that a change of property did affect physical acquisition, and not that it didn't, because Beis Shammai turned around and said the reason it didn't, we're not talking about a physical change. We're talking about the principle of money being earned due to illicit gains, and therefore it's repugnant to Hashem, whichever form it comes. Doesn't matter if you change the physical properties. The way it was earned is the same. Doesn't matter. It's not like a brocha where it changes from Adamah to Shiakor, where that property changes. The entire act is repugnant. But at the end of the day, then Rava has this contestation against the buyer's assertion as well, apart from Rav Papa. So he's saying, look, Rava says to him, says to a buyer, because Rava and a buyer are often at disagreement, he said, on what basis do you assert that the Tanaim that a change doesn't affect acquisition? So he goes through each one of them. He says, look, as far as Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda is concerned, it doesn't say that more than that a change is inconsequential in the case of a die. Because he's saying that generally, they're saying that dying is enough to change the physical properties. If the farmer is having the first of his shearings of a man and a half of 5 ewes, that when you die one, it can't be added to the total amount for your requisite 7.5 manna. So it's going to change the property, so it can't be on the total. So but according to a buyer, he's saying Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda is quoting Rabbi Shimon. In the case of the die, it's inconsequential, not because the physical property change doesn't matter, but because the die is removable. So in this case, because it can be removed from detergent, it's not a permanent physical change. He learned that any temporary physical change doesn't affect acquisition. If it's dyed with indigo, that physical change is permanent, therefore that would affect acquisition. So what Rava is actually arguing with buyers, each rabbi that a buyer is bringing, each of the Tanaim to say that that particular Tana doesn't agree that physical change affects acquisition. Rava is saying no, it does. They're making exceptions in it. The first one was from Rav Papa. Beis Hillel and Shammai really do agree that a physical change does affect acquisition. It's only Rav Gurion of Asberg, and therefore those few Tanaim have to go with Beis Shammai because everybody else goes with Beis Hillel. That's halacha. The case of Rava, quoting Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, who quoted Rabbi Shimon, he's saying, listen, the Rabbonim say that the physical die does affect a change. It doesn't, in this case, according to Rabbi Shimon, who's quoting Rabbi Shimon, is because the die's temporary nature. it's reversible through detergent. It's not indigo. So he's saying that's why. It's not that they don't hold that physical change doesn't affect acquisition. It's the temporary nature of that dye problem. And then if you want to have a look, Rava's got a different opinion to Rav Papa. Because Rav Papa is saying the reason Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel don't disagree. Rava is saying that they do. But what the issue is that Beis Shammai generally holds that a change does affect acquisition, meaning that if it was changed, in the case of Baba, that the item give monetary exchange compensation. In the case of the wallet, different. A couple of factors. One factor that's different, going before the Most High, and with respect for Hashem, the Most High, it's repugnant. Whereas when you take a monetary case of theft, as long as you're providing financial compensation to the owner, there's no issue as far as change. Does it? But you can't insult the Most High by doing an act that is repugnant to him and then decide to bring it in a court, no matter how many times you change it. Because Hashem knows what, and he doesn't accept bribes. So generally, that means that Beis Shammai holds that a physical change does affect acquisition. This is an exception. So what Rav is doing is he's arguing with the buyer, when a buyer is using these to say that these two don't agree that physical change. Rav is saying that they do. Cases are an exception. So he's bringing another case. He's saying, fine. Now let's take Eliezer ben Yaakov, that when that change is inconsequential with respect to a blessing, or it's a mitzvah that comes about through a transgression. So what are we talking about here? Is the fact of it is that the challah has to be separated from the Cohen, and the guy took dough, and firstly he took flour, made it into dough, and then made it into bread. So there's physical changes. And the buyer is saying that this means that because that's seen as a transgression, there's a question as to whether or not you're allowed to make a blessing over it. And he's saying not. And since you're not, in that particular case, it proves that even if you've changed it from grain to dough, that physical change, which is not even recognizable from the original grain, doesn't affect acquisition, nor does changing it from dough to baking it, which means a physical change according to a buyer doesn't affect acquisition. And Rav is saying it does. There's an exception in this case, because you can't do a mitzvah transgression. Meaning, there's no mitzvah when you're stealing an article. You made a transgression, you've changed the wood into a chair, planed the wood, you've altered it to a permanent change, and therefore you've got no choice but to give the money back to the original owner. Here you're doing a blessing before Hashem for something you stole, even if it wasn't intentional, but you failed to separate the challah, which means kept what was not yours. The difference between a premeditated theft and an act of, should we say, theft, but through lack of consciousness, it's not the same level. You certainly can't do a blessing over a transgression. They're saying that's not that the physical change does not affect acquisition, grain to dough, dough to colour. And that is exactly why that it's not accepted. Because if, in other words, the principle is if you took it from grain to dough, what was in transgression when you made a physical change now becomes yours. When it becomes yours and that challah doesn't belong to the Kohen, it's yours. Therefore, you can make a brocha on it. And therefore, even if you take the dough state and bake it into challah without separating it, if it's physically made a change, it's yours. And therefore, you can eat it and it's not an act of theft. Just like we learn with the case of a Kohen for the first sharings, if you dyed it and forgot to give it to the Kohen, you don't have to then give it to the Kohen. That's according to the general Tanaic opinion. But they're saying this case is a little different because you're not only keeping it for yourself, but now you want to bless Hashem by doing a brocha. Whereas there's no brocha when you're separating wool. What brocha is it? When you're keeping the wool for yourself. In other words, you're not adding insult to injuries. They're saying in this case it's an exception. Now, if you have a look at this case, Shimon ben Elazar, it says, do not say that there's more than a change is inconsequential with respect to a deterioration that is reversible. So what did Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar say? He turned around and said, you stole an animal, and then you returned an animal that was nice and fat to half dead to the owner. So then it's a physical change. Why don't you keep the animal and just pay the cash of what the animal was worth? How can you return it? Because the only way you can return it is saying that the physical change doesn't affect acquisition. Then no matter what state you return the animal, you have to return it. You can't give the cash equivalent. So Rav is saying to a buyer, that's not a proof. That's not a proof that physical change is inconsequential with regards to an animal that's deteriorated. He's saying the reason that you can return it and it doesn't become acquired by the figure of monetary equivalent is because if an animal is emaciated and malnourished, what do you have to do to get it to the previous state, guys?
You've got to give it more food.
All you have to do is feed it. That's it. So it's reversible. And therefore, we know that a physical change that is reversible, that has no permanence, doesn't affect acquisition. So Rav is saying to a buyer, that's not. Okay. And if you look as far as that, so that's with regards to deterioration. And with regards to appreciation, saying, well, why can he keep it in that case? In other words, if it appreciated, the thief should keep it. Well, the reality is that's not physical permanent state either. Why? Because if you let the animal starve, it will lose gains. That's not permanent either, is it? Appreciation.
No.
So you're dealing with the same problem. Now, as far as Rabbi Ishmael is concerned, it says, what's this case of Rabbi Ishmael? You have to designate payout to the poor. So you said, listen, you had standing grain, then you chopped it, then you bashed it, then you threshed it, and you turned it into flour, and then you basically baked it into dough. So the argument here was at every stage, when you forgot to give it to the poor, just because you changed the physical property doesn't mean you also give the payout to the poor. So therefore, that was the proof that Rabbi Ishmael said that a physical change doesn't affect acquisition with regard to payout. In other words, if you took a standing grain to flat, then you took the wheat from the chaff, etc. There is an opinion that if you then began to not separate it, actually crush the grain, but then the only thing that they said is that at that point, the tithing, the minute you crush the grain and it becomes flour, that's when the tithing kicks in. But what you have to do in that case is, in order that the poor don't get less, you don't take the tithing away from the poor side. You still separate the payout first, but you take the tithing away from your side. Because the minute the grain gets crushed, you basically inject the protocol of the tithing. Does that make sense? But the poor aren't going to suffer. So that's a proof that no matter what physical change you do, it still belongs the payout to the corner of the field to the poor. Which means if physical change doesn't affect acquisition and go to the farmer, it goes to the poor. That's a proof, according to a buyer, that it's still physical change doesn't mean anything. Rav is saying it does mean something. In this case, there's an exception because there's a superfluous word, you shall leave, is written. In other words, if you look at Leviticus Vayikra chapter 23, verse 22, it says twice, you shall leave it. Because it says that once in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 10, and it says it in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22. The sense it mentioned it twice. It says that, according to Rabbi, saying that Rabbi Ishmael probably agrees, in most cases, physical change does affect acquisition. And that's why there was a special scriptural derivative of mentioning that twice, because that provides the exception. That's not the rule. Okay. Now, there's a slight problem because there's a possible objection that the Gemara raised. It said, look, if you're going to counter Rav's argument and say, let us derive from the case of pair that a change is inconsequential with respect to all other matters as well, I will answer that the gifts of the poor are different. So what is it actually saying? It's saying, look, at the end of the day, generally, you've got this thing called a binyan av. Guys, do you remember what a binyan av is?
The first ruling, the first point of the main issue.
I would say that's accurate. Just a cleaner way to say it, it's basically an establishment of it's an establishment of a model. In other words, if the Torah states a law in one place, we extrapolate that law can be applied in similar cases. So as Kevin's saying, it's the first principle. Once you establish a general principle in a certain set of circumstances, when there are other circumstances that are very similar as well, we basically apply the same sort of rule. So what it's saying is maybe this should serve as a model for other areas of law, and that Rabbi Yishmael in general should hold that a change doesn't affect acquisition. This could be an argument against Rabbi. In other words, if this is the exception, but this is the base principle, then surely in other cases regarding charity case, apart from pair, like Maisa, etc., that there could be that binyan av, that you give it to the poor no matter what physical changes take place. Once you've got this principle. But the principle of binyan av teaches us to apply a law stated in one place to other matters. But this is the key. It pertains only to matters that are similar and comparable to the source law. Because we've got the target law and we've got the source law. So if the mitzvah is to give gifts to the poor, that's a different feature from other Torah laws. So in other words, it's saying that you can't derive other matters from binyan av. In other words, you can't have a different feature to say that properties don't affect changes that are permanent don't affect acquisition in the case of a thief. Because what does a thief have to do when he makes a physical change from wood to a chair to the original owner? He has to make restitution. So it's saying the only thing that you could say here that maybe binyan av is established cases of where the original person decided to con the poor out of it by making a physical change. So we learn that the laws of pair, you can't con the poor out of their share. So maybe in the other cases belonging to the poor, like ISA or tithings, you can't get cute as well. But application can't be extended to a thief, because the only time you can have a binyan av is when the circumstances are so stuck. Like, for example, application to the poor. Not general principle of application for physical change doesn't have any. That's the result. Get what I'm saying? So Rabbi's argument still stands. There's no issue as far as that. Okay. Now, Rabbi still cites support and there from an earlier Moira for his contention that Rav Yishmael's ruling might be due to the superfluous "you shall leave" the pasuk, right? Because he maintains as a general rule that change does not affect acquisition, according to Rabbi. So he's saying in the case of theft, any changes to that physical article that has to reverse the original, and he keeps the change, but not that binyan av can only extend to other cases of charity, because it says, as Rav Yonasan inquired, what is Rabbi Yishmael's reason for thinking that pair must be separated even after the grain has been made into dough? It's because he holds that in general that change does not affect acquisition. Or perhaps maybe he holds that in general the change does affect acquisition. But whichever way he rules, whatever Rav is saying, whether he's saying that you can hold it as a rule, in other words, Rav Yonasan is basically saying, look, Rav is just saying to a buyer, you can't have any concrete rules. He might hold that a physical change does affect acquisition. He might hold that he doesn't. But either way, you can't prove your case from this buyer. All he's saying is that the reason you can't is because there's a special spiritual derivative of the extra word "you shall leave." That breaks the theory that this can become a binyan av. It's an exception. So if he does hold that or he doesn't, it doesn't matter. You can't source from here because of that extra superfluous you shall leave. The Gemara says, okay, so if you conclude that Rabbi Yishmael's reason is that he holds that a change doesn't affect acquisition, then how do you answer the question about the superfluous you shall leave that Hashem wrote in his Torah? So that's what they're saying. It's saying it's a very good argument for Rava. In other words, how can Rav Yonatan and Abai and Rava entertain the possibility that Rabbi Yishmael holds that in general change doesn't affect acquisition? But if that was the way, why would it be necessary for the Torah to state twice, you shall leave? What are you going to learn? It must be that in general change does affect acquisition, and only in a case where there's a special derivative make it. Okay? And furthermore, you can ask another question. According to the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yishmael, and they maintain that one is not required to separate pair after it's undergone change. In other words, obviously, there are many Rabbanim who don't expound that superfluous shall leave, and that you remain liable to separate pair even after the grain undergoes a physical change. In that particular case, why did you need it in the Torah? In other words, if you argue, Babai argues that a physical change doesn't affect acquisition, you've got to answer the question, what was the superfluous shall leave that verse 51 wrote in his Torah? How are you going to answer it? So the Gemara says, listen, you can use it to learn. If you declare your vineyard ownerless, and then you arise early in the morning and reacquire the vineyard and harvest it, it's subject to the laws of Peret, Olielos, Shichacha, and Peah, but it's not subject to the laws of Tav. So let me just give you an idea of what's going on. So there's a principle that any crop that originally was ownerless, for a while, doesn't matter how long, was ownerless. If it was reacquired by the original owner itself, it's not subject to the laws of Misa. Because the Torah exempts one who acquired an ownerless crop from separating Misa, right? Now, the fact that he himself once owned the crop is absolutely irrelevant. If he declared it ownerless and then acquired it before somebody else did, he's off the hook with Misa. Or he acquired somebody else's ownerless crop. Well, it wasn't somebody else's, it was ownerless. Either way, is exempt from Misa. But this is the issue. With the laws with respect to Lechet, Shichacha, and Peah, unless you repeated the word to leave those portions to the poor, we would think that that person could get out of giving those payments to the poor. But with respect to Misa, the Torah doesn't repeat the commandment to give Misa. So that's why we had actually derived that the original owner himself, when he basically reacquires his vineyard, after he declared it ownerless, he's exempt from Misa. So obviously, guys, you might say, well, doesn't Hashem hold him responsible? If that was intent to get out of Misa, he'll never get out of it. But from a legal point of view, in this world, he got away with it. But the repetition of the word "you shall leave" said he cannot get out of the other payments to the poor. Do you get what I'm saying, guys? He has to actually give Lechet, Shichacha, and Peah. And how do we know this? We've got in Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 24, verse 21. You've got Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 9 to 10. You've got Leviticus, chapter 3 to 22. And it says that you shall leave in one. So that protects. Those are three places. And that lets you know to protect the following. Peah, obviously, apart from the Peah, the Shichacha and the Lechet. Now, one thing you've got to establish is that there can be a binyan of those three items because we're talking about in context of giving it to. Do you get what I'm saying? So you can make that application as far as that's there. So all that Rabbi is saying is that, and the Gemara is saying, is that you it might not be subject to the law of tithing or Misa, but the reality is you've got an issue, okay? So Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, the halacha calls with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Meaning, I think before we go there, what I'm saying is that this is just one question, one thing, Kev, that it's not saying it's a proof for Rava, but it's a proof. What it does do is it breaks a buyer's ability to use that as a proof. It says it's an exception rather than the rule in all these cases. Do you get what I'm saying? All right, guys, we've got 7 minutes left. We can end off on this note. Are we getting?
I just want to ask a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we so with the payer, that the payer must be left to the oni, to the poor person. Is
Yes.
that wheat that needs to be harvested? What is that wheat that's been, is it corn, or is it what actually is it? Is it actual just the wheat plant? What is that?
Okay, it can be more than one thing. It's a grain. So for example, if it's
Grain,
corn,
sorry, grain, yeah.
no, if it's corn, if it's wheat, you've got the kernels in corn, and you've got the ears of corn, and you've got the chaff. So there's the parts we can use and the parts that you can't. The part of threshing and winnowing, separating what's usable, what's not. So initially, that's the issue was if it's standing in a state before harvesting and it's changed to a fallen state, physically made a change, then that should get mean that because of the physical change, it no longer belongs to the poor, it belongs to the farmer. Then we're saying, okay, but then it's another physical change of winnowing it, in other words, putting it to bundles. And there's another physical change of separating from the bad. Then there's the making of the flour, and then there's the dough and the bread. So we need to protect the poor no matter when there's a physical change. So what a buyer was saying is that proves the name, this particular Tana holds that physical change doesn't affect acquisition of the farmer. What Rav is saying is there's a special puzzle that's repeated twice. In general, this Tana believes that a physical change does affect ownership change. But in order to protect the poor, that's why it was passed in the court. That's what
Okay,
he's
so
saying.
basically,
It's not a proof.
do the poor expect to have to do, would they be expected to do the threshing and the winnowing, all of that themselves? So they need the actual, so if there's a change, if the farmer changes it, he's basically, he doesn't get the mitzvah. If he gives it to them in a state that's not usable or practical, then he can't, he doesn't get the mitzvah of
Not
payout.
necessarily, for two reasons. It could be that the person made a mistake. Let's just take a perfect case, not of the pair, of the challah, that he didn't separate the challah for the corn, or he sheared the first shearings and he forgot to separate it for the corn before he dyed it. So whether or not he gets the mitzvah is up to Shemaim. Hashem, Most High, knows his intent, and therefore whether he gets punished or rewarded will be on the fact, was he forgetful? Was it a genuine mistake? Was it perpetrated in order not to give it to the poor of the Kohen? What were the motives? They can't deduce this on earth. The only thing they can deduce on earth is who has legal rights to the person. And therefore the earthly court is meant to distribute justice and enforce policies in order to protect all people. And therefore the courts are saying, in order to protect the poor, even if you make a physical change and you think that affects acquisition, because it does in the case of a thief, where he only has to take monetary compensation. Well, no matter what you do, it still goes to the poor. At least the case of the thief, the reason why he can give a cash equivalent, he put so much time into making wood to a chair, he'd never do it to sugar. He's not going to give up all his hard work. But he might turn around and say, I feel bad about stealing wood. Let me give the guy wood back. So he's got a mechanism for teshuva. But biblically, he doesn't have that mechanism for teshuva. It's rabbinic, in order to help him. According to the biblical thing, he has to return the article as is. He has to return the chair as he stole it, because the wood is still part of the chair, even if he can't separate it. But we know that once people put in effort into it, they're not going to make it teshuva. So the rabbis enacted a way for the thief to make it teshuva by giving a financial equivalent of compensation, but not where the thief put in a lot of labor.
Well, you can't return the original materials. That's it, exactly. It's not
Well,
practical.
even
Yeah.
if you can, I mean, if you steal a car, you go for a joyride and you put 1,000 rand of petrol, and you know that the original owner isn't going to compensate you for that 1,000 rand after you start the car, you figure I'm not having losses here. But if the rule is you can return this car, but he can reimburse you petrol, you're going to want to make a teshuva. But according to the biblical enactment, you have to return it, whether there's petrol in or not. If you put in the petrol, that's your tough luck. If you really want to do it, teshuva, you do it. And the rabbi said, who's holding at that level? That's the issue with the animal and appreciation. So if you asked if a person's going to get a mitzvah, still, if he separated it and then gives it back to the poor, well, it depends if there was negligence, forgetfulness, purposeful intent to deprive the poor in order to keep themselves. Hashem knows intent. The law is there just to ensure proper application where public gets stuffed here.
Yeah.
Guys,
Shkach. What time tomorrow?
Yes. What time